On March 17, 1943, a report landed on a desk in Berlin that carried more destructive potential than any explosive device in the German arsenal. It was not a blueprint for a new weapon or a map of a coming invasion. It was a statistical projection, a single sheet of paper summarizing intelligence gathered from the American home front. To the recipient, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, the contents were terrifying because they were mathematical. The report focused on a single factory in Michigan, United States. The intelligence claimed that this facility, operated by the Ford Motor Company, was preparing to produce a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 60 minutes. For the leadership of the Third Reich, this claim was patently ridiculous. It was physically impossible. German aviation engineering, the finest in Europe, required weeks to handcraft a comparable heavy bomber. The idea that the disorganized, racially diverse, and politically chaotic United States could roll a 4-engine aircraft off an assembly line every hour was dismissed as a crude psychological operation. But Canaris knew better. He understood that this wasn't propaganda. It was an industrial death sentence. This is the story of how a single statistic signaled the end of the war, and how the Nazi leadership's refusal to accept it sealed their fate. To understand why this report mattered, you must understand the man holding it. Wilhelm Canaris was an anomaly within the Nazi hierarchy. He was a career naval officer, a conservative traditionalist, and a man who dealt in cold realities rather than fevered ideology. While Hitler and his inner circle operated on intuition and fanaticism, Canaris operated on data. By early 1943, that data was becoming grim. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had shattered the myth of invincibility on land. In North Africa, the Allies were tightening the noose around Rommel. Yet, in Hitler's headquarters, the mood remained delusional. The leadership believed that German will, superior Aryan genetics, and wonder weapons would inevitably turn the tide. They viewed the war as a spiritual struggle. Canaris, however, viewed it as a logistical equation, one that Germany was losing. The intelligence had not arrived all at once. It trickled in through a network of spies in neutral nations, attaches in Washington, and business contacts in South America. They all pointed toward a massive construction project near Ypsilanti, Michigan. Willow Run. The numbers associated with Willow Run were incomprehensible to a German engineer. The factory floor was not just large. It was a single room stretching nearly a mile long. The sheer scale required the building to make a 90-degree turn to remain within county tax boundaries. But the architecture was secondary to the ambition. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, had proposed applying automotive assembly line techniques to aviation. In Germany, aircraft were built by skilled craftsmen in static stations. Teams of specialists would move to the plane, fitting parts one by one. It was a slow, precise art form. Ford's plan was the opposite. The plane would move. The workers would stay still. The B-24, a behemoth with over 1 million parts, would be broken down into sub-assemblies. Low-skilled laborers would perform a single repetitive task, drilling one specific rivet, welding one specific seam thousands of times a day. When Canaris's analysts ran the numbers, the conclusion was stark. If Willow Run achieved its target of 1 bomber per hour, that single factory would produce over 600 heavy bombers a month. At that time, the entire German aviation industry was struggling to produce a fraction of that number. Canaris took this intelligence to the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. This meeting represents one of the pivotal disconnects of the war. Canaris presented a logistical certainty. Göring responded with ideological arrogance. Göring, a World War I ace and a man deeply corrupted by power and luxury, refused to look at the paper. His dismissal was rooted in the Nazi worldview. To Göring, the United States was a nation of shopkeepers and mongrels. He famously remarked that Americans were good at making razor blades and refrigerators, but incapable of building high-performance aircraft. There was a racial component to this denial. The reports indicated that Willow Run's workforce was integrated. It included women, African Americans, and people with disabilities. Canaris, who had indeed been protecting resistance members and sabotaging Hitler's diplomatic efforts, was eventually cornered. They believed that discipline created quality. They could not comprehend that the American system, a chaotic, democratic mix of people, driven by mass production efficiency, could outproduce the so-called master race. Göring dismissed the report as a bluff. He forbade his staff from taking such defeatist numbers seriously. While Berlin scoffed, Michigan worked. The start was difficult. The plant was initially mocked as Willow Run due to logistical nightmares and housing shortages for the 42,000 workers. But by late 1943, the Fordist principles took hold. The factory became a machine of war. Raw aluminum went in one end. A fully fueled B-24 Liberator came out the other. The workers that Göring despised were proving to be the most productive industrial force in history. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was a welder on the line ensuring the fuselage held together. The specific breakdown of labor meant that a worker didn't need 10 years of engineering experience. They just needed to be perfect at one specific motion. This was the arsenal of democracy in physical form. It wasn't about heroism, it was about volume. It was the industrial avalanche Canaris had feared. The result of the German refusal to believe the math was the destruction of the Luftwaffe. By 1944, the skies over Germany were filled with the very planes Göring said couldn't be built. The Allied bombing campaign, particularly the Big Week operations, targeted German aviation production. The Luftwaffe fought bravely, but they were fighting a hydra. For every Messerschmitt shot down, there was no replacement. For every B-24 shot down, 10 more were crossing the Atlantic. German pilots were exhausted, flying sorties until they died, while American crews rotated in on fresh aircraft. The German fuel reserves dried up as bombers targeted refineries. The rail lines were severed. The economy collapsed. It was a war of attrition, and the variables were determined by the production rates Canaris had identified a year earlier. For Admiral Canaris, the burden of foresight was heavy. As the war turned, his realism was increasingly viewed as treason. The SS and the Gestapo had long suspected the Abwehr of disloyalty. Canaris, who had indeed been protecting resistance members and sabotaging Hitler's diplomatic efforts, was eventually cornered. Following the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944, the net closed. The regime needed scapegoats, and the man who had persistently delivered bad news was an easy target. Canaris was arrested. On April 9, 1945, with American artillery audible in the distance, Wilhelm Canaris was executed at Flossenburg concentration camp. He was stripped and strangled with piano wire, a vindictive end for a man whose primary crime, in the eyes of the leadership, was seeing the world as it was, rather than how Hitler wished it to be. When the war ended weeks later, the Allied inspectors examined the production records. They found that Canaris's terrifying report was actually conservative. At its peak in 1944, Willow Run did not produce a bomber every 60 minutes. It produced one every 63 free minutes. Ford built nearly 7,000 complete B-24s at that single facility. The difference was not courage. It was not tactical brilliance. It was supply chain management. The tragedy of the German war effort and the lesson for history is that the information was available. The spies did their jobs. The analysts ran the numbers. The warning was delivered. The defeat was cognitive. The Nazi leadership had constructed a reality filter made of arrogance and bigotry. They believed that spirit could overcome physics, and that ideology was superior to economics. When presented with facts that contradicted their worldview, they chose to attack the messenger rather than adapt their strategy. March 17, 1943, marks the moment when the war was lost not on a battlefield, but in a filing cabinet. It serves as a permanent reminder that in any conflict, whether military or political, the most dangerous enemy is often the comfortable lie we tell ourselves. The B-24s of Willow Run prove that reality eventually always wins.